colors in an odd way. So it's also important to know that you're not going to have the same level of material that will be as durable in one of those cheaper swords. And so it does serve you both for the longevity of the item to get a more expensive one if you can the first time around. There's a saying out there that says, you know, you buy nice or you buy twice. And that really happens with some of these lower tier items because they're not meant to ever go outside or be handled at all.
And that really goes to deciding what you want to use it for. You know, are you just looking for something to add to your impression? It's going to hang off your belt and look pretty as you walk around. Are you actually using it for reenactment battles? Because that's a completely different subset of what we would call a sword or a sword-like object, because that goes into blunts and sort of, you know, the medieval fighting swords and HEMA swords, almost HEMA training blunts work as well too sometimes. But, or, you know, are you using it for cutting demonstrations? Are you using it for all of the above? Well, you can't really use a cutting sword for the combat. That doesn't really work. But so figuring out what you want to use this sword for is really important as well. And that's really gonna drive what you buy and whether or not you need a good stout blunt to do combat with, or if you need something else entirely.
I really wish that our community had come up with a better term than blunt, but I'll just have to go with it. You bring up a really good point, you know, back to the idea of safety, is that the application of the sword is very important, because if you want a perfectly historically accurate, authentic, down to every specification sword, that's cool. I mean, that would be awesome. But you also have to remember that the sword is a tool that's designed to kill other people. And as such, if you have a perfectly well-designed one, you can kill other people with it. And so you have to take special care to understand that if you're going to have a perfectly accurate sharp, that you're going to have to take a different level of care of it when there's other people around. And this is really a consideration for the public as well as for immersion events, because the last thing someone wants to do is to mix up their sharps and their rebated weapons and then hurt somebody, even outside of a public situation where, oh, you know, don't hand a kid a sharp sword. Yeah, we get that. That one's intuitive, but, you know, don't accidentally, you know, grab the blade of a sword that you expected to be dull on the edge and cut your hand or cut somebody else's hand or anything like that. So if you're buying your first sword, the question is, are you going to have the same level of versatility if you buy yourself that sharp sword that you want to be able to cut with and you want to say is, you know, supremely authentic, versus is getting a rebated one that you can also do mock fights with a better suit for your purposes, even if it's making a compromise for authenticity, because we all know that every blunted weapon has to be made slightly different. You can't just take a rebated sword that you would be able to use for HEMA and then sharpen it later and have it function like a regular sword. The blade is actually made differently so it balances and functions correctly when it's blunted. And it takes, you know, a really good swordsmith to be able to shape the blade specifically for those purposes. So at some point, you have to make a choice as to what this is being used for and stick to it, because not every sword works for every purpose.
And also you get to take into account that some venues and some events won't let you carry a sharp around with you. They specifically forbid sharps being used on site. So if you want to be able to go to those events and wear your sword at them, you need to have a rebated sword to carry around. So as always, like I said before, you got to check with your group, check with the events, make sure what you're looking for fits within all the parameters. And that's even before you start getting into the whole like style debate of what you want to get. So it's really, there's a lot of research work just even leading up to it.
I think there's a point to be made that every item you pull into your kit, be it a weapon or an article of clothing, should come with a fairly steep level of personal research before you put it on. I think that's where a lot of mistakes get made, in that people throw things together without having done their due diligence first, and it's something that I've done before as well. It's easy to go, well, I have a feel for these other items, so this probably fits. And then with you crack open a book and you're like, ah, dang it, I really should have gotten a different item. So when you're looking at swords, there's a lot of things to consider. There's the purpose, as we talked about, just kind of as a recap. There's the purpose of what you plan on doing with the sword. There's the time period you plan on wearing the sword for, the type of people you're going to be interacting with while using the sword, whether or not you plan on pulling it in and out of the scabbard. And then, of course, something we didn't talk about, but is one of those other common refrains is your status. I mean, there's a point at which certain people would not be carrying certain types of swords, and based on their impression. Your peasant doesn't get jewels on the hilt of their sword, and you can't really say, oh, well, I won it in battle, because, well, your lord takes the spoils and then divides it back out to you, and he's not going to let you keep that one, So it's hard to justify having too immaculate a weapon, and so it's easy to find a really beautiful sword and then sort of outbuild your neighborhood when it comes to the rest of your impression.
And that's something that we talked about in one of our podcasts. I don't know if it's come out yet. The justification.
It hasn't yet. No.
That's right.
Yeah.
The justifications we talk about, where basically you come up with a story saying, "Oh, well, I've had this sword because it was passed down through generations of my family." It's like you gotta be careful. It's like if you're somebody from the late 16th century, you're probably not going to be using a sword that was passed down from the 11th century. It just wasn't going to happen. So these justifications are things. There's a little bit of leeway, because it's like if you're portraying somebody from 1400 and you have a sword from 1350, like, yeah, that's a little understandable. There's sort of a sliding scale here, but you got to use a little common sense when you're doing this. But personal style, I mean, we all like to show off our own personal style, and then swords can be a way of showing off our personal style, because we get basically this big piece of sharp jewelry saying, hey, this is what I
jewelry. Like that.
This is what I like. This is what I think represents me, and it can be very representative. It's like, so Ari, what's your favorite sword?
So real quick, I want to correct myself.
Oh.
Justifications was the most recent episode that came out, so it was out on the 15th. So people can, if they haven't heard it already, listen to us talk about that last 1 minute of conversation for like an hour, and break that open into a lot of unpack it, so to speak. So my favorite type of sword. So I don't have necessarily a oak shot type memorized. I myself have a preference for the longer two-hand sword, just because I'm a really big guy and I'm tall and I have long arms, and proportionally regular, even like the bastard style, hand and a half style swords, all sort of feel on me very like they all kind of blend into the arming sword. They all feel a little shorter on me, and so I have a preference for that longer sword that is a little more on the cutty, swingy side than on the stabby side, even though my impression is 1400 to 1410, and there's a lot of that stiffer blade, shorter blade, thrusting type weapon, especially since I like to do harness fectin as well as everything else. I find that I just aesthetically like the way that longer sword looks in my hands or worn on my belt. Even this handweight tinker that I have here is a little on the short side. I like them a little longer, unless on the other hand, unless I'm going with a single hand sword. And then my favorite style is the arming sword hilted, but heavily sweeped with the notch in the back style falchion. I just love that sort of scimitar-y look in a single hand sword. So I really like that straight double edge long sword and these sort of swept back falchion style single hand sword. Those are my favorite styles. And when it comes to ornamentation, I'm a bigger fan of darker colors, bronzes. Bronze is probably my favorite. I tend to gravitate towards lots of brass and gold and bronze in my just sort of general aesthetic. So when you're talking about like dark colored leather wrappings or wood with, you know, bronze or darker accented hilts and pommels and things, I'm not a huge fan of like really, really bright, shiny, glistening swords, except on the blade. Obviously, the blade should be shiny. But on the handle part, I like the darker, sort of heatier tones.
I'm really gotten into the what's known as the Alexandria Arsenal sword, the oak shot type 18C. So this is it's a about 1400, late early 15th century sword. And I love this sword because I love just the big, beefy, wide blade that this thing has. And it looks to me like that's a war sword. That's what they, knights would have carried with them. It just seems like it's got so much versatility to it because it's got that big blade for chopping and cutting, but it's also, thick enough that it has that you can use it for leverage to really get in there and work against it. So that's my favorite sword right now. I have to say I'd really love to get one. And of course, the best one that I know being offered is probably the Albion Alexandria. And I do know a couple of other companies offer similar. There's an interesting review of the Ronin Katana Euro #3, it's called, which is basically the same thing. They call it the Alexandria Light because it looks like they probably based it off of Albion's design, but tweaked it a little bit. And that looks, I've heard some really good things about that as well. But, these are all things when you're doing reenactment, you're going to find there are vendors who sell so many different versions of the same thing. And each one of them is going to have a different quality measure. So those quality measures usually come with a price tag, but it's also just going to be little things that you'll see when you're looking at these swords. And as you become more into reenactment and paying attention to these things, you start to notice them even faster than before. Like, there are a number of companies that sell very cheap scabbards that go with them. And when you first start, you kind of think, oh, scabbard's a scabbard or whatever. When you get into it, you start to really see the difference and how it affects the portrayal, and can also affect the care and keep of the sword as well, because a sword will actually carry better and be better protected in a well-made scabbard than it would for in the cheaper one. So,
and I know that there's a lot of interplay based on your time period on wood core scabbards versus purely leather scabbards, but a wooden core scabbard does provide some protection against, like, especially storage. You put a sword in the back of your trailer for transport, and something happens to shift on top of it. You can put some stress on and bend in the blade that other scabbards could protect it from. Not that there's one narrow case, but there's something to be said for when we're packing stuff around or throwing stuff around, or we trip and fall onto our sword, that that it does provide a certain level of protection. But not all scabbards themselves are made with good wood cores. A lot of designer swords, if you get them, the more sword-like object things. I actually saw a scabbard where when I pulled it apart, because it was starting to like flex oddly, it was just like that thick, like U-box style cardboard that was on the inside. It wasn't even really wood. It was just sort of appeared stiff for a short period of time. And so you can really do a number on your blade, because if it's filled with anything that absorbs moisture, and you spend any time with your weapon in the scabbard, now we realize that we're not supposed to store them for a long period of time in the scabbard. But if you spend a weekend with your sword in the scabbard, and it's a scabbard that's made from a material that will absorb moisture, you can do some damage to the blade of your sword.
So we're getting some chatter in the chat room. People talking about things. We talked about the using an older sword, and Kent It says, as I recall, Oak Shot's records of the medieval sword found several older 12th century blades that have been rehilted with newer crosses, grips, and pommels in like the 14th century, so that they look more up to date in later Middle Ages. And then Andrew Fraser, hi Andrew, friend from, we'll listen to your talk later. There's quite a few swords that are repurposed for many 15th century German blades ended up in North Africa being used by Bedouin during the 17th and 18th century, for example. So yeah, yes, they did repurpose these things. And that's something, if you want to go to that level and buy basically two swords and take them apart to make it look like a repurposed blade with updated fittings, that'd be amazing. That is going to like a sort of a next level.
Sure.
What we're talking about is basically buying a Norman, like a Henlad Tinker Norman sword because you like it, and I have one, I love it, and then wearing it with your 14th century gear and saying, oh no, I used this sword because it was passed down through the generations. It's like, that's not what would have happened. They could have taken the blade and updated it to fit their style, but very rarely, if ever, I can say, would they say, I'm just going to keep the sword the exact same way it is because it was passed down. So
yeah, and that's a huge difference between, and like I was mentioning before, this is where we go into it for like an hour on the podcast, is there's a huge difference between justifying the use of something that doesn't make sense and having something that is applicable to your impression, even if your impression is something that's unique or narrow. And we discuss at greater length the different levels of justification versus evidence required to make a good impression. And if you're taking an older blade but with new furniture and that's part of your impression, then that's not some sort of justification that you're using something that doesn't belong. You are just like people who were wearing clothes that have been restitched together. We have examples of noble outfits that were made piecemeal from other cast-offs, cut-offs, or repurposed old garments where they wanted to keep the material. You're not using an old garment out of character in that context. So these are very good points that people are making here in the chat, as well as Stephen makes a really good point about how you're adding weight to your outfit when most sword-like objects are not usually made to the same weight profile. A lot of it comes down to that myth that swords were really heavy, and so people who are selling swords that don't know about them to people who don't know about them sell heavy swords sometimes, just because when your layman picks up a sword they buy from Bud K, then it's big and heavy and sword, cool. They just don't get it. And so you might be adding unnecessary amounts of weight to your body, which, depending on your impression, if you're in a martial impression, it's pretty important to keep an eye on how much you're carrying around with you, because it can get pretty heavy when you're in harness.
And Anton Stark, very knowledgeable himself here, posts about how there are some examples of older swords that were sold and re-entered into the market and kept. It says, a will of a Portuguese bishop who died in 1326 at 80 years old, and the executor of his will had to sell the swords bought in the late 13th century for his retinue. Those were 50-year-old swords. A bunch of them rejoined the market, as it were. That is something that did happen. Yeah, I'm not saying that people never held on to these things and it was a myth that they were passed down. What we're saying is making the excuse for your portrayal to have something that doesn't really fit.
And there's a huge line between a 50-year-old sword and a 200-year-old sword. It's one of the sort of where we're also making a distinction in that there's a lot of nuance involved, and there are really good examples of old swords showing up again. However, the next step was that old sword then carried by a militiaman on guard duty, or was it taken into combat? And then at the same point we don't really ever see a 200-year-old sword show up again in any reasonable way, especially not in any depiction of war.
Except what Stephen Gowan just said, James Elmsley has an example of a Katzbalger that was re-hilted on a Viking sword. So that's an extreme example. I mean, like everything, like Ari just said, there's nuance in all of this. Yeah, you will probably find examples like that on the extreme. This talk and what we do about reenactors, we generally shoot for the most common established fact, or most common, not fact, but most common established portrayals. So when we portray these things and we go out to the public and we try to teach them about that, we're trying to teach them about the common, the common denominator. I don't want to say the lowest common denominator because that's something completely different. But we shoot for sort of the most documentable from all sides when we do our portrayals. So yeah, there's always going to be outliers. There's outliers in everything, but it's when you're especially starting out in your portrayals. And I'm not sure how many people we have here that are listening in who are newer to the reenactment world, but you don't really want to go for those extreme outlier cases.
Sure, because we're trying, usually an impression, at least the foundation of impression, should be really demonstrating the rules and not the exceptions. And the number of exceptions that we incorporate into our portrayals should be minimal, because it gives us the unfortunate opportunity to portray an exception as the rule to somebody who only spends 5-6 minutes with us at an event, or only sees the 1 minute of a 20-minute presentation online, and then they come away with a misconception, and misconceptions are hard to debunk. So we try to avoid, at least my philosophy is to try to avoid creating any myths of my own. And so there are lots of really interesting small examples that advanced living history folk can definitely demonstrate to each other and can use to sort of deepen and expand the foundation that they have. But it's sort of, there's a saying that it's kind of crossover saying from culinary to filmmaking, oddly enough, and it's don't touch the fish. And it comes from the methodology of training sushi chefs traditionally, wherein you start by either making rice or you start by cutting vegetables, and you do that for years until you can do that flawlessly, and then you build up, and one of the last things you do is actually cut the fish and assemble the sushi roll, as I understand it. And so the idea is, especially for newer reenactors or even those who are kind of in the middle of their journey, is that sometimes it's really appealing to go touch the fish, and it's important to have a really strong foundation for what you're doing, because when you incorporate these exceptions, especially when you show this really awesome example of the Viking rehilted of a different sword, it's harder to show why that's so interesting if you don't already have the contrast with what is normal. Because if you don't know what the normal is, if you don't know what a normal sword of Viking would carry and the variations that were available to them, it doesn't give as much contrast as to why this one particular case is as interesting. So that's the majority of our discussion here, is how to definitely start out and how to use these tools, especially obviously here swords, to create a strong foundation in what the standard and the rule was. And from there, we can then, especially amongst ourselves as advanced practitioners, discuss all the nuances. And I don't ever want to give the impression that we shouldn't explore these other really interesting one-off or small use considerations. Those are fascinating, but they are almost more fascinating in contrast to what we know is normal.
So, so we have some.
Yes, I will always blame the militia.
Comments in there. David here says, he has an 1896 Springfield rifle that's a fine functional firearm. If something as complex as a rifle can work for over 100 years,
yeah, but I'm not going to take that to Iraq when I'm trying to, combat people who have fully automatic weapons. It's, I can go hunt a deer with it, but I'm not going to take it to war. So,
and a lot of that is, looking into, especially in these cases like that Portuguese priest who had the swords that were sold, that 30-year-old swords, 50-year-old swords that were sold back into the market. why were they keeping these items? Did he have a personal? It said it was outfitting his retinue, so he had personally had his own armory, basically. And yeah, we know that they kept things in armories that were wildly out of date, um, for their militias, basically for their town guards and things like that. So we do know that happened. It's that, like James Elmsley said, it's the span of the time frame for it. It's like he says we have he has t-shirts from band gigs in the 90s. Owning a 30 plus year old item is entirely normal. It's when it's in the 300 years you start getting silly. So that's what we're talking about. And, again, that would be a great detail if you are part of a group that's setting up, you're outfitting your own town guard, that you throw in some items that are, wildly out of date. I probably wouldn't go 300 years out of date, but, 100 years out of date wouldn't be too bad. That could be, a really interesting detail, as long as you explain that it is out of date, but why are you doing it that way? If you are going to start doing stuff like that, you need to do the research in order to back it up for your portrayal. So
I think that kind of answers sort of what Anton just brought up. What about situations where the exception is the rule? And that goes back to, if you're doing the research for your particular portrayal, then it's not necessarily an exception, because it is cohesive with the rest of your portrayal. So as he references the out-of-date equipment used by the defenders of Visby, it was not out of character for that impression. It would be out of character for their aggressors to be, in a portrayal of that battle, to be wearing the same equipment as them, because it was cheaper for the other reenactor to buy. And so it's all about making sure that your impression is internally coherent. And I also want to address, David, I did misunderstand where your intent was going with that. And so I understand what you mean now about, just acknowledging that things can function over long periods of time. And I agree with that. I mean, as a, all the sword geeks here probably love Lord of the Rings as much as I do. And, we all remember what happened to Boromir when he wondered whether or not the sword was still sharp after 1,000 years. So yeah, they can survive and they can be useful in certain contexts. It's just important that you define the context and why you're bringing it into your impression, and whether or not it fits the cohesiveness of what you're trying to portray. And that at some point we don't bring in so many oddities that we've lost track of what it is the person would have actually may look like at that time. And what would be oddities to other people, such as the disparity between equipment at the Battle of Visby, those oddities are only makes no sense if you try and blend the armies, take pieces of each side, and don't make each style cohesive with their own culture.
And Anton makes an excellent point, of the context. We need more context for our choices. And that, so a lot of what we've been talking about and what we focus on is really for the beginner reenactor. A lot of what, Anton's talking about here, and I agree with everything that he's saying as well, that's when you're starting to get to that next, you've made your decision, where do I go to next? And that's really, like I said, the next level. And when you start really digging into the research of these things, not just like the basic weekend warrior, I'm going to be an English soldier from 1400, so.
Now, these guiding principles on making sure things are sensible and coherent and cohesive with your weapons, and really apply even to the advanced category. As you start to go into deeper, more nuanced areas, these ideas that you need to keep in mind of what is the purpose of introducing this to my portrayal? How does it improve my portrayal? How does it give a better demonstration of the impression I'm trying to put across? These guiding principles still apply. It's just the selection both narrows and expands as you start to go advanced, in that you have access to more oddball things, but then again, you also have more work to do to acknowledge the proper context. And there are contexts in which almost anything can be introduced, but they don't always need to be, and it's more difficult to do. So it's just a challenge. And as long as we're facing these challenges with good principles, then we're going to be able to do so in a authentic and authoritarian way, where we're not making more myth than we can solve.
And that's what I really think. Well, when we say, don't use the excuse of, well, it was handed down from my great great grandfather, because a lot of times that is just it's just used as an excuse. We don't have, a lot of people don't go digging deep into the research of it to explain why it would have been. They just sort of put it out there as an excuse to sort of a freebie, a get out of jail free card of, why do you have a sword that's 100 years out of your time period? Oh, it was handed down from my family. It's, instead of saying, well, I'm doing this because I am a, spearman at the Battle of Visby, and this is what they had, and getting into the details of that. So basically we're saying, don't take the easy way out when you do it.
That's right. So we have about 10 minutes. Do we want to do, I know we've been responding to the chat, but do we want to take questions from the audience with our remaining time?
If anybody has any questions, do you want to unmute yourself or raise your hand? Exactly, Andrew. Same excuse as my impression travels to this place, so they have Y sword or X helmet. Yeah, exactly. So if anybody has any questions they want to ask, they can unmute themselves or raise their hand and I'll unmute you or something. Anybody have anything they'd like to say?
Well, hi, I'm Kent.
Hi, Kent.
I think I kind of opened a can of worms here, and I apologize. I love the discussion. I think you guys are very knowledgeable, and I appreciate all your efforts. I think the thing that I had started with was, you're right. I think it bothers me when somebody shows up at a reenactment event and they're part pirate ninja belly dancer and they have a Viking sword and a scimitar, and it's like, where are you coming from? It really doesn't enhance my experience that way. But I think the thing that I was angling for was that how you looked, how you presented in the medieval period was very important. So if you did have old gear, you wouldn't want to show up with it. It was the effect you had on other people in the medieval period was all important. And this is from, anybody who could afford it, say middle class men at arms, all the way up, of course, to the aristocracy who beggared themselves in order to afford the richest kinds of things to present. So I think that it's important to know that even if you do have an old blade, okay, because it's good quality or because it was passed down or whatever, it wouldn't look like it. You would have maybe a scent stopper pommel and a newer crossguard and a tapered grip. It would have been repurposed and rebuilt and redone if the blade was that valuable, because they're the harder things to temper and make and maintain over the time. You might hang on to that, but you wouldn't let it look 100 or 200 or 300 years old. That just wouldn't go.
Yeah, exactly.
You're absolutely right.
Excellent point, Ken, and thank you for bringing that up. So, yeah, and we have evidence for that happening across so many things, in clothing, in armor, in furniture, in architecture, swords. If you were somebody of status, the showing off that status was a huge part of this. So no, you wouldn't, even if you had that sword, 200, even 150-year-old sword, you wouldn't want to show up to a battle with that old sword, even if it was 100% perfectly serviceable, usable, never been used before, brand new looking. It would have hurt your reputation to show up with something like that. Now, that being said, what everything else we talked about, if you're portraying one of the lower classes, who might not have a choice, it may just be a, 13th century bishop saying, here's a sword I found in the backyard, go defend the church. So it's that's one of those things where you might not have that choice. But yes, if you are portraying somebody of any status, that is definitely a consideration you have to take.
Right.
Yeah, your reputation was incredibly important. And Ken, you said it great, and I don't really have much to add because you summed it up really well. That point is an important one to remember, that conspicuous consumption, the idea of status, portrayal, your fama and reputation, they were paramount. It was your likes and reacts on Facebook. It was how important you were, was what you could show off. And so that context is important, and you have to keep that in the back of your mind when you're assembling your impression and deciding what to pull in.
Great, thank you. Yeah,
I think we got time for maybe one or two more. Anybody else have anything they'd like to add or ask?
Hello.
Hello.
Hey.
Hi. I don't want to belabor the point or to just stick up for the little guy here. I'm always focused on lower class representations and depictions of soldiers. And one thing we must keep in mind, I think, when choosing our swords is the fact that the same thing that happens with armor happens with the swords too. Although not to that great of a degree, in that most surviving swords, or at least loads of surviving swords, are high-class examples. And it's it's a bit tricky when we're trying to portray a low-class soldier and we go, oh, but I want a sword like Henry V's or something like that, and there's a gap in our knowledge concerning what a lower class sword of the time would have looked like, or a bunch of them would have looked like. So what I agree with everything Kent said, but at the same time, that doesn't really work for the lower classes like that. Because for the lower classes, you have people that don't have swords, they're given swords by someone else, and swords that were bought, bunch of them for a penny each. Just simple swords, just handed out. And there are not very many portrayals of those swords in reenactment, precisely because we focus on the high class stuff and the high class rules for choosing that stuff. Thank you.
I agree with you 100%, Anton. I do. It is hard, and that's why I think we said the context of things. Looking at what you want to portray, looking at the history of it. Like if I'm portraying a archer at Agincourt, no, I'm not going to have a Alexandria Arsenal sword strapped to my side. I may have, and this is just talking about swords, because there's a whole litany of other weapons that could have been, used, of course. But no, I agree. So that using that context of, what is my status, what's going on here? Yeah, an archer could probably use a sword from a much earlier time frame, because it was something that was kept in an arsenal and handed down to him, just to get him out in the field. So, like, context, yes, I agree, is king in this. And we do lack, you're correct, we do lack a lot of information and portrayals in the reenacting community of the lower status equipment. And a lot of times people look at, they think lower status and they say cheaply made, which there is some argument for, yes, there's probably a little more cheaply made than the upper class one, the level, there's a level sliding scale, we can say. So, but I think in modern times when we're purchasing, cheaply made in the modern sense does not translate to cheaply made in the historical sense. So, I mean, a cheaply made historical sword is still a sword that you're going to be able to take into battle, when a cheaply made modern sword is just a piece of junk.
Well, yeah, and there's one of those artifacts that we find when we're trying to do this research is that, one, people were resourceful and they did a lot of recycling. And when we're talking about like munitions level gear, a lot of that war gear was a consumable item. And honestly, even higher end things like swords and armor, you bring it to a tournament, it was considered a consumable item. It didn't necessarily need to survive. You needed to survive, but your armor didn't, your sword didn't. As long as it got you through, you could get another one, or it could be repaired, or it could be replaced. And so a lot of these things, especially the lower end gear, were either destroyed as part of its use, part of its intended use, or were then eventually recycled into something else, either by rehilting or by completely reusing the material. And that does create kind of a black hole, because only the really, really good stuff tends to, with small exceptions, tends to survive for 600 years. And the lower quality things, you know, they wear out, they get recycled, they get trashed, they get reused. And so lower quality things don't necessarily, as he was saying, mean that they're unusable or anything like that. You know, even munitions level gear is probably superior to some of the lower status like armor and weapons that come out today. But also a lot of times people didn't, you know, this was the feudal era. A lot of times people were outfitted by somebody else, and at some point your servants were a reflection of you. And so whenever possible, you would, as much as you wanted to demonstrate status on your own personal wealth, I mean, you would want to decorate the people who belong to you in such a way that they represent you up to the status that you want to be regarded as when someone sees them absent of you. So we also see a lot of that in that, you know, there was a small segment of society that was kind of hung out to dry when it came to equipment, but we also have plenty of iconography, such as, you know, illuminations and such, that show that your average soldier was really well equipped, and that was not because of their own resources. But that's we're talking about feudalism, and we're talking about social order, and a little less about swords here. So,
and to get back to what Anton said about the you know, sort of lack of presentation of some of these lower class swords, I think one of the issues we get into that is a little bit of modern consumerism, because a well-made historical sword, even if it's supposed to represent the sort of lower end scale of the swords, if you want a well-made sword, it's still going to cost you a lot of money, because not many places actually make those swords for sale. So it's still going to be like a custom sword that's going to cost you money. And a lot of people, you know, modern consumers, they say, well, why am I going to spend $700 to $1,000 on a lower end sword?
In for a penny, in for a pound.
Exactly. So, I agree with you, Anton. I also portray, one of my portrayals, you know, is an Agincourt archer. So, but a lot of the stuff I do have to get custom made, because they just don't make it, because everybody wants the big flashy, and they don't want just the run of the mill everyday stuff. But so thank you for that, Anton. So we're at 11 o'clock. We're coming up to our first break here. Our next session starts in an hour, and it is Peter Johnson will be talking, swordsmith. So thank you all for tuning in for the first hour. And basically, I'm just gonna, the Zoom room's gonna stay open. You can come and go as you please, or log off and log back in. If you like what we were talking about, check out our podcast, How to Medieval. Again, it's available on Anchor. You can get it through Spotify. Also, you can check out Ari's site, which is the Turnip of Terror. .com. Is that turnipofterror.com, Ari? Is that? Yep. And also, he's on Facebook on the Turnip of Terror, and Instagram. And of course, I'm on History Live Northeast. Remember, History Live Northeast, we do this all for free for schools and everything. So if you like what you're seeing, and if you feel like making a donation other than what you did for your ticket, please send me an email, and I'll see what we can do. So thank you guys for tuning in, and we'll see you in an hour.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Ari. Bye.